A world in turmoil on the heels of an extraterrestrial invasion, the cities of Earth collapsing, and all of our finest cutting-edge technology, even the atom bomb, proving feeble in any attempt to defend us. There had never been anything quite like this before, but there have been a million things after. Such is its legacy. Gene Barry, Anne Robinson, the film adaptation of H.G. Wells' 19th century novel brought to 1953, The War of the Worlds. I first read H.G. Wells' novel, The War of the Worlds, when I was in high school. I am currently about a quarter of the way back through it, but I got roped into watching the movie again. I've watched the film a few times over the years. Even when I rented it on VHS from Blockbuster in college, it was awfully grainy, not real clear. The color wasn't fabulous. Only recently did I discover there's a very retouched, updated, modern-looking version that it comes through so well and so clear now that most of the time it gives you the idea that it's like a low-budget made-for-TV 90s movie with slightly better special effects. Like they were remaking it with new technology, but trying to make believe it was 1953 because the update of it makes it look so clean and presentable, and the details really jump out of the alien, of the Martian machines, the Martians themselves when we see them, the scenery, everything. Now, of course, you're updating the original novel, so instead of horse-drawn artillery, you have tanks, you have planes. We do see the appearance of an atom bomb, updating the story from being in rural England or south of London to being in California in the United States post-World War II. But it really captures the whole flavor and feel. I don't think that anything can quite do justice to... I don't think that any of us today, or at any point in the 20th century, can understand the impact of H.G. Wells' work at the time it came out in literally the 19th century. When you were writing novels in the 1890s that present an extraterrestrial invasion of our planet, the earth-shattering nature, literally, of this technology that he imagined, and this is obviously not the only thing he wrote. So much of what he wrote was very prophetic, very prescient, incredible stuff. But when you get to the horse-drawn buggy parts and the horses helping people escape the Martian invasion and the book, you really, wow, that was the culture that was reading War of the Worlds. We will never know what it felt like to be those people reading it at that time. But reading the novel and having the sense of the greatness of the novel in our own time, the 1953 film does wonders with the story. I won't even get into the nonsense that the Tom Cruise movie barely, in a lot of ways, Independence Day was more of a War of the Worlds movie than the Tom Cruise one, but that is entertaining, but it is not, I mean, that is just not a great film, although I confess to seeing it and having probably seen the sequel. What the 1953 adaptation does is something that is rarely seen anymore. It is an update and a modification of the story, but it is done in a way that does its best to capture the spirit of the original. The science is accurate, at least to the degree that we understood those concepts at the time. There's a couple of scenes that strike us as odd, pointing a Geiger counter, realizing radiation's off the scale and not, being all that concerned. When they detonate the atomic bomb, people are way too close, which kind of makes us feel awkward, but this was the era that you see footage of this, atom bombs being tested while infantry are part of the exercise, marching towards this giant mushroom cloud. You're like, man, the things that we went through with technology. Nevertheless, what War of the Worlds really does well is give us what Wells did. In the novel by Wells, we have a lot of different characters, but they are mainly sort of symbolic of types of people. We don't see a lot of development in a lot of different individuals. The story really is about the Martian invasion, and therefore it's about humanity's reaction to these invaders. It captures a lot of the motifs of 19th century fiction, science fiction, even some of the horror like Frankenstein that crosses the genre. The idea of the fearfulness in science. Rather than science run amok, it's can science defend us from this? And you have more of a sense of a culture earlier than ours where the degree of respect for people in these fields was such, well, it was just much higher. And what they were doing was much more alien in its own way to the general population. And so we kind of chuckle because we have different specialties for things. But, you know, when these old movies reference things like, well, he's a professor, you know, like this means something. Well, Dr. So-and-so is a scientist. He's all sciencey. And, you know, and we're thinking, well, what is he, like a physicist? Or is he like, you know, quantum mechanics? Or what is he doing? We're a little bit more spoiled in our time with these sort of our awareness of these things, but is also part of the way our technology and science has grown and adapted. So the whole motif of the sudden frightening threat from space, that constant unknown into a culture, the Cold War is beginning after World War II. You're coming into a culture where paranoia, fear of war, some still exhaustion from war, and the fear that there are enemies out there and there could be war, and you project this into outer space. You can't control this. The Martians just land. They're here. You cannot. You have not prepared. You have not been able to weigh your technology against theirs. There's been no arms race. They just drop in, and they are literally way above and beyond you. And what do? The heroic stand of the human race at various places in the story, trying to at least delay, first trying all of our weapons, finally trying the A-bomb, having no effect, and then turning to science, but refusing to give up. So they're going to continue to retreat, fall back to the mountains. They will fight until scientists can come up with an answer. There's got to be something. The real human turn in the movie is right there with the idea of scientists having to come up with some sort of clever answer. And our resident protagonist, professor, scientist guy saying, you know, we can't defeat their machines. We've got to defeat them. We have to get at their biology. And because he managed to get a hold of some smear of a Martian blood during a close encounter right after the first battle, they've got something to look at. Something that they have looked at through a microscope and said is very anemic, very weak. They believe they can get at them through their blood. And so we transition from conventional war, atomic war, to the possibility of biological warfare. But it really drives home that the fear of the unknown, the fear of the unexpected, the fear of being caught unprepared, but also that hope. Will science be the answer? Will we be able to develop a defense against the unknown, mysterious forces of the universe? And the conflict of that with the weaknesses of human nature. And that was what really makes the story brilliant. We don't get a lot about the professor. We don't get a lot about the young lady that that cooks him breakfast. We don't get a lot of development of these relationships other than they symbolize various people, the general, the military, the clergy, the bureaucrat, the reporter. But at that climax, when everything depends on science coming up with an answer, and there are vials, and there's a development of a weapon they believe they can let loose on the Martians, it's all cast aside because the mob began to panic. People fleeing the city hijack the trucks, they steal the bus, the product gets dumped out, all the material they could have used to study, to research, to maybe develop deliver a bioweapon, it's all sort of lost as the panicked mob runs off, and our professor is left wandering the streets in this emotional agony of this was our last chance, and it has dissipated. Until finally catching up with the young woman who cooked him breakfast, they enjoy some time at church. And there's an interesting degree of religiosity in the movie because it is the 50s. People were a lot more active churchgoers, and you have this percentage, not a huge percentage of people, even then, realistically, but you have a percentage of people that seem to have stayed, not fled the city, and they're in pockets in the various churches. Rather than get trampled by the mob or killed later in the mountains, they choose to go to the place of prayer, pray for God's deliverance, but wait for the next life in the least unpanicked, undestructive, personally way. And so finally he encounters her at church. They're there at church. People are praying together, praying for God to intervene, waiting for the inevitable to come. And of course, this is the moment where, if you know the story from the novel, it's at that moment that the Martians suddenly begin to die because they are diseased. They have no immunity. Now, there's a number of things about the story of War of the Worlds that, beg some questions. Did the Martians not look into that first? Did they learn enough about our biosphere to attack us, but they weren't prepared for that? That's kind of odd. Although the film version kind of leaves open the idea that something, perhaps in those busted vials, something in that material they were working on to try to counter the Martians biologically, maybe that being smashed into the street by the mob who stole the vehicles, that might be why these are the Martians that die first, at least that we see. Always this possibility that they were prepared for other things, but not something that we artificially made. But as the Martians die off, the world is saved. There's a lot of church bells, there's a lot of prayer. The end comes rather abruptly after we see the creature's spindly hand reach out and suffer final death, the release of death musculature-wise. And the brave professor scientist goes up and touches it and confirms that it is dead. The biggest difference then is in that between the whole overarching theme of Wells' novel and the film. In the novel, we essentially prove powerless consistently, and it's kind of just the God in the machine. It's the grace of God Almighty answering their prayers, or it's just this accident that they have no immunity to these things and they suddenly die. Exposure, ironically, to wiping us out, eventually needing to pump in our air into their machines, exposure to our splatter, whatever, they become exposed to these germs and they die. Whereas there's a lot more in the movie version of human efforts and determination to try to resist. They don't go to pieces quite as easily or as quickly. And there are people in power that have more of a sense of a plan, that this is now, we fall back, we retreat, we go into a bunker, we will keep on fighting, even though the mob goes to pieces. There's a little bit more optimism of the human spirit in that, although it could also be that when you're making a film at the beginning of the Cold War, after World War II ended, you don't want to put out there, it's not wise, nor is it necessarily marketable to put out a story about humans that just go to pieces and cannot weather the storm. So what we get is humans that with dignity, though realistically many people flee, they trample each other, there's theft, but we get the pockets of humanity at the churches who want to die with faith and dignity. We have the people in authority that are retreating, drawing up their plans to keep fighting until the bitter end. There's a much greater optimism of the human spirit rather than a complete helplessness against whatever's in the void in the novel. But it's a fabulous movie, and it is at that turn when the bioweapon is being planned, when the materials are destroyed and the vehicle stolen, that's when our actors really come through. They have it up until then just been types of individuals in humanity, but that angst-riddenness of our scientist to see that the last best hope, as he figures, is being destroyed by people's panic and their fear and their cowardice. They buckle under, which is understandable under the circumstances, but nevertheless, their buckling under and their panic is going to undermine what last chance we have. And that, of course, becomes the thing that drives the professor off the deep end. He's clearly almost out of his mind with angst and fear until he finds her and they're together again. And in that, with getting together with the people in prayer and all the emotions they go through, that's when it really takes on the human moment, which works for the film motif-wise, because up until then, as I say, they've represented types of human beings, while it's really been about the Martian attack, how we respond. The final part of the film is getting at the depths of how we respond to the fear and panic of the mob, the deliberation of the scientists, the determination of our government and military to fight on, and these brave people that gather in prayer to hold each other and pray to their God until the end. There's it's a development that takes it from the abstract into the cosmic and down to the personal, and settles that whole issue inside the heart of where fear becomes your worst enemy, and even worse than death. Because at the end, the people huddled together in the churches are going to end up dead if the Martians hadn't died suddenly of the germs, but they want to go with dignity rather than those who have gone cowardly, panicked out into the night. It's one of the oldest films that I have seen multiple times, because you run into this difficulty of the whole way we receive it in its level of special effects and cinematography and all that. It's hard to get some of those old movies and to feel them the way they were felt when they came out. But I've watched it more than once, and now seeing the retouched version, man, it was on Amazon Prime included, but it is out there if you can find it. The 1953 War of the Worlds, spectacular classic film. Everybody should see it at least once. I loved it. 2 thumbs up. Let me know what you think.